Welcome back, AP Psychology students. This is the final video of the saga that is Unit 11. Still looking at this theme, kind of nature and nurture, but specifically we're looking at group differences, so things like race and gender and those kind of things, and looking at how and possibly why those groups may differ in their test scores, and then looking a little bit at bias and intelligence tests. So whenever I talk about group differences, we say like, oh, men do better than women at this, or women do better than men at this. I really want to drive home the point that these are usually quite small differences. So if you look at our frequency distributions here, like in this case, a bell curve, if you think of this kind of, on the X, Y axis, so these are all representing the frequency of different scores. The thing I want you to notice is that these curves overlap by a lot. So if you're a female, if you look at this chart, is it possible that if we're saying that this was like math ability or something, and we say, oh yeah, males outperform females at math, or you could be a female and still be doing better than quite a few males. So I don't want anybody to leave here today thinking like, oh well, males are just, it's not like these two curves are like completely separated from one another. They overlap by a lot. So we're not talking about major differences here. We're talking about small differences. And we're talking about large groups of people. We're not talking about any individual necessarily. So I just want to drive that home. For example, this would be kind of the same idea, but with like, height and weight. So you could see, on average, men are larger than women, but there's plenty of women that are larger than, all the women that are over here, would be larger than men who are on this part of the curve. So just want to drive home that point. When we look here at different groups, the research does show some differences in IQ scores. This would be in the United States, I believe. So it's not really important that you memorize those numbers. Just know that there's some group averages that do exist. Do understand as well that when we say low SES, we're talking about socioeconomic status, which is a fancy social science term for, how rich or, poor, a group, person is, or family is, or whatever. So, again, you see some group differences. You see some differences when it comes to, socioeconomic status. One kind of interesting anecdote is the best predictor of a person's score on a college entrance exam is their zip code and their parents' income. So, a big part of and we're not saying that necessarily causes people to be smarter, like having more money causes you to be smarter, or being smarter necessarily causes you, but there's definitely a correlation there. When you think about the opportunities that people that have higher income levels might get that those with lower incomes do not get. Think about differences in, quality of education and, extracurricular opportunities and all kinds of things. But when you look at these group differences, most researchers believe that these differences are due to environmental factors. I don't know if you've realized this in America, but we've come a long way, but there are still some racial issues in this country, and a big part of it is the fact that there's still unequal opportunity for some groups of people, by and large. And one example of this, without getting too off topic, is residential segregation. Our schools are more segregated now than they were in 1980. Look at our school. Drive down the road 10 miles into Des Moines. Look at those schools. Go to, a 1A school in, a small town Iowa. We're very segregated. And so there's a different experience for different groups of people. So again, most people think that the differences in groups is due to environmental differences. the way that the opportunities that are given to different groups. A couple other things when they've given intelligence scores to young children, even infants, we talked about that in another video. Those scores were equal among all races. We see that the gap between the scores is getting smaller and smaller as things do improve when it comes to equality in America. One interesting way of thinking about it is the largest difference between groups in like intelligence test scores is your age right now, so like high school. And the big reason for that is, like we just said, how schools are segregated and there's different opportunities. So we see the largest difference is like senior year of high school. And then when students go off to college, we see that gap shrink. And the difference would be, if a student from a suburban school goes to the University of Iowa, and then a student from inner city goes to the University of Iowa. Now their quality of education, their opportunities are more similar than they were when they were in K through 12. So that would contribute to a narrowing of those gaps. We've talked kind of off and on how some of these tests can be biased, just the way that they're worded, some of the cultural references. I know test makers do make an attempt to avoid those things, but it can be just kind of an inherent, kind of an implicit thing as well. Think about the people who make those tests are still going to largely be people of upper classes. Given that the breakdown of our population in this country, it's very likely that they would be white versus minority. Those things can kind of add up. And then we've also seen, think about the Flynn effect, how things have improved over time. One thing of note is like minority groups today outperform, if you look at their scores versus scores of white test takers from like the 50s and 60s, minority test scores would be better than white test takers from 40, 50 years ago. So a lot of the evidence again suggests an environmental cause for that gap between groups. When it comes to gender differences, like I showed you those curves, there are some small but somewhat reliable differences in groups between those. Really, you can read more in the book, but the big idea would be males tend to outperform females mostly at things that are nonverbal. Math, spatial abilities. When I say spatial abilities, think like the ability to, like if they show you a couple of images, one that was like a rotated version of the other, they would say like, okay, is this the same image rotated or is it different? Males as a group tend to outperform women at those kind of tasks. Or think about being able to pack the back of your van full of luggage and make all of it fit perfectly or whatever, or the ability to throw a football 20 yards while another person's running after it and hit them in stride. So just kind of an understanding of different objects, how they are relative to one another, those kind of things. And then females tend to outperform males at, we talked about last unit, the ability to detect emotion, sympathy, those kind of things. And then just about everything that involves verbal skills, reading, writing, verbal memory, girls tend to outperform boys at those things. So again, go back to the beginning, group differences, that whole spiel. So the final thing here, we're talking about the question of bias. So if you think about those terms, reliability and validity. So are these, what do these tests tell us? What do they not tell us? Are they valid? Are they reliable? So are they reliable? So an IQ test. Generally, yes. Meaning if you take different forms, but the same IQ test repeatedly, they're not going to change very much. I remember I had a student years ago that he borrowed it. Now I don't have it because he never returned it. but he borrowed one of my IQ test booklets, and he was getting mad because he was like, Mr. Dowell, like, my score's not going up. And I'm like, dude, did you miss that day in class? Because they're reliable. If a good IQ test is measuring aptitude, you're not going to change that over the course of a few weeks, that kind of thing. So they are reliable. Are they valid? Well, that all depends. Think about your definition of intelligence. So it's hard to define. You might have a different definition of intelligence than I do. You may not think they're valuable. So that one you can't really say for sure. Now, when you talk about predictive validity, what we will say is, if you think about things like job success, academic success, then higher IQ scores do predict those things. There is predictive validity when it comes to, do they predict job success and academic success? Are IQ tests fair, or are they biased? This one's also a controversy. Do know that group differences exist, and so the mere presence of those to a lot of people says, oh yeah, they're definitely biased. I don't know that I buy that necessarily, but it would be something to definitely take pause at. And IQ tests are equally valid in predicting success for all cultures, all groups of people. So if you have this certain level of IQ, it predicts success the same, whether you're white, black, brown, orange, purple, whatever, you name the color. But again, if we're giving these tests that have topics or questions that tend to be geared more towards certain groups of people or certain definitions of intelligence, does that exclude some abilities? And that's really for you to judge. Generally speaking, most experts acknowledge that a certain level of bias is to be, it's kind of unavoidable, but know that the people that make those tests do work to try to limit that, but it's still present. I'll leave you with this. There's one other topic I really thought was interesting in this unit. It's this idea of stereotype threat. So basically what the original study here was, they brought in a group of white athletes and a group of black athletes at Stanford University. And they had two different conditions. One condition, they had was like some putting contest or whatever. And when they brought some white students and black students in, and they told them that the test was a measure of athletic ability, the black students did better than the white students. Second trial, same task. Instead this time they told them that this task was one that measured strategic thinking. And when they did that, the activity was actually different. They just framed it differently. When they said it was strategic thinking, the white students outperformed the black students. So what we're getting at here is this idea that if a stereotype even exists, that you're part of a group that doesn't do very well at something, it can actually lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's a lot of interesting research on this. A little bit of it's mixed, but there's enough that it's worth mentioning. Another one was they found that women did worse on math tests when they were in a room with men. And it was even worse if the test was proctored by a man. So, just makes you think, have you ever been part of a group that supposedly wasn't as good as another group at something, whether it was a sport or a certain class or whatever, and just that mere presence of that stereotype kind of made you doubt yourself. So that's the idea of stereotype threat. So to wrap up, there's some bias, not only in the test, but the way we kind of perceive ourselves. There are some group differences. A lot of those are probably due to environmental factors. But, the jury's still out a little bit, but that's kind of what the research points to. So I think that's a good place to stop. Interesting section. Please bring any questions you have to class, and we'll talk about them. Thanks, guys.